Today's daf is daf Tesvav, and let's just remind ourselves that the last thing that we learned on daf Yudalid Amid Beis was a member in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that holacha beregel lo shmei holacha, which is both a chumrah and a kula. It's a chumrah in the fact that the Kohen has to move forward with his legs in the direction of the Mizbeach with the Mizrach, with the Kli that has the dominant. It's also, in a sense, the flip side is a kula, because if the Kohen does not move forward with his legs, then if at the time that let's say he stretches his arm out towards the Mizbeach, he would have a machshavas psul, that machshava would not pasal the carbon, because that whole loch is not valid. So now we start daf tesvav. Efshal sakna o EF Shosak. The Gemara is going to have a series of questions back and forth, vacillating. The first of which is whether or not, if let's say there was no holacha beregel, and is it possible to retrace his steps and then fulfill holacha beregel? Now, conceptually, again, this is more for an Ian shear. What the Gemara is vacillating about is whether or not holacha shelo beregel is just nothing. It doesn't register. And therefore, he can start all over again. Or no, once he did the holacha shelo beregel, that passes the carbon, and therefore he cannot rectify it. Toshma, kibel hakosh v'nosan lepasul, yachso lakosh. So we see explicitly from this brisa that you can actually rectify the situation. What happened is the Kohen, who was kosher for the avodah, received the dam, and then he handed it over to someone who's posel, in this case a non-Kohen, a zar. And the brisa tells us that all you have to do is give it back to the kosher, right? And he'll retrace his steps, and then he'll bring the dam in the kli as a holacha towards the mizbeach, and then the zrika will be kosher. Everything will be fine. The Gemara adds, "Unehi nami diyachzar akosher v'kablenu," and again, the Mishnah that we just quoted, which in effect is the Mishnah later on in Daf Lamed Beis, could be understood to mean that the Kohen who's kosher should pick up the holacha, and he can just move forward towards the Mizbeach when he picks up the dam from the hands of the Zar, the non-Kohen. He just goes further. But again, that doesn't upset our conclusion that you can be metakin it, meaning now we're saying it could be he doesn't even have to be metakin it. There's no need to retrace the steps and go backwards. Just let him pick it up from the Zar and move it forward, and then he'll fulfill his holacha. The Gemara now goes back to analyze this proof from the Mishnah. Isal gedak lo efshel sakna ipasla. Well, why not assume, as we said before, in one of the two possibilities about which the Gemara vacillated, that the holacha, which was without regel, is a posel, and if that be the case, when the zar picks up the dam, and he, let's say, if he moves with it, or if we want to return it back to the Kohen who's kosher, in any event, it should be possible, because we're saying now that a non-qualified holacha is a psul that generates a positive psul in the carbon. So the very fact that after the Kohen kosher gave it over to the zar, he can still get it back from the zar and fulfill holacha means that the fact that the zar moved forward towards the mizbeach with the dam would not in any way passel the carbon. It's just the absence of holacha, which can be rectified by giving the blood back to the Kohen kosher and him doing and fulfilling the holacha. So Gemara now wants to reject this raya Mi savris dekoi zar gavoy lo dekoi zar broi. Our assumption was that when the non-Kohen, the zar, received the dam, he was moving towards the mizbeach, and the position of the Kohen kosher. Let's say this is the mizbeach. Let's say so. Here's the Kohen kosher. Here's the zar who's posel. The zar is forward, closer to the mizbeach than the Kohen kosher. And if that be the case, by giving it over to the zar is setting up a holacha, and then we prove, as we did before, that you can do a takana, you can rectify by giving it back to the Kohen kosher. But now the Gemara suggests maybe not. Maybe the Kohen kosher is closer to the mizbeach, and the zar is further than the mizbeach. And if that be the case, then by handing the dam to the zar, that's not considered a holacha. Holacha is always moving towards the mizbeach. So it seems at the end of the day, the Gemara leaves it as an open-ended question without establishing any proof. Itmar. Now we go back to the statement that we started with here, which was on the bottom of Yudalin Amid Beis of Ula in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, but there's one important change. Here it says, Omar Ula Rabbi Yochanan, holacha shelo beregel psula. Until now, the original formulation that we had on the previous Amud was lo shmei holacha. But now we're upgrading it, and it's called a holacha psula, implying perhaps that there's a positive psul here because there was holacha shelo beregel. And by going that far, Rabbi Yochanan is telling us that the carbon is automatically, immediately possible, and therefore almo we see that lo efshel atakna. There's no way of rectifying it. However, in the footnote here, he quotes a Shita Mekubetzes, who has a slightly different approach to this new statement of Ula in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Ula tells us that according to Rabbi Yochanan, the halacha of shelo beregel, that it's not considered a halacha, that was the original statement in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. But that the new statement says in a very strong language that halacha shelo beregel psula, it's invalid. And why would he add such a thing? What does he mechadish here on top of what the original formulation was? The answer is that ef shalasakna. Eisvei Rav Nachman le'ula. Are you telling me that there's no possibility of rectifying this invalid halacha? What about a Mishnah later on? He tells you here that the Mishnah is on Daf Lamed Beis. Nishpach min akli al haritzpa. Now, let's try to give a little background. There are two situations of what's called nishpach. The most radical situation and the most profound lifsol of nishpach would be if the blood spurted out of the neck of the animal after shechita and went down onto the ground. That's before there was Kabbalah in a kli. A less radical situation would be where the dam was received in a kli, and then the kli tipped over, and the dam now fell on the floor. So first, we're going to analyze the less, the less radical case of nishpach min hakli al ritzpa, and now the Kohen goes down on the ritzpa and he starts shoveling it up via safa. And the Mishnah establishes kosher. Now, when dam falls out of a kli, it spurts in all directions. So therefore, it's presumably logical that some of the dam moved towards the mizbeach. And if that be the case, that's a situation of halacha shelo beregel. And yet, the Mishnah allows the Kohen to gather up the dam from the ground and transfer it over to the mizbeach. So apparently we see that even after a halacha shelo beregel, you could still rectify it. Gemara answers no. Hachmayas kinon kshiyotza lechutz. That when the dam fell out of the kli, it fell bachutz, meaning further away from the mizbeach. So that falling and flying through the air cannot be considered halacha, because as we said before, halacha is only when you move towards the mizbeach. So Gemara says, "Lebroi nafka legavoy lo yael." There's no such thing. It's impossible to say that when dam falls, it all goes in that direction. Some of it will go forward, some of it will go backwards. And the Gemara gives three answers. Number one, b'makom midron, maybe there was a sloped area, and therefore the dam moved away from the mizbeach down slope. Two, ibay same beguma, maybe the dam fell into a hole, some sort of digging in the ground, and it got stuck there, so it didn't go forward at all. The third answer is besmicha. Maybe the dam was very thick, and if it was very thick, then it doesn't spread around in all directions. So Gemara asks the following question: You've just imagined the wildest situations. Ichpal Tana Lashmina Kolhani. Does it make sense that the Tana went all the way to teach us these strange cases, these unusual cases? There's no indication at all that that's the case. The Odin, furthermore, Adatani. This is a more lumdish kasha that the Gemara asks. There's another Mishnah that talks about the case where the dam went from the neck of the animal after shechita and fell onto the floor without Kabbalah in a kli. It didn't fall from the kli after Kabbalah in the kli, but rather dam fell directly from the neck of the animal. And now the carbon is possible, and it won't help at all if the Kohen gathers together the dam from the ritzpah. Liflog b'didei. Why did the Tana, if he wanted to tell me a case of psul, have to stretch his arm out to a different case where the dam was nishpach directly from the neck of the animal? Why not stick to the original case where it fell from the kli? And liflog b'didei, b'medvar mamurim, when can you salvage the situation if the dam fell backwards in one of those three scenarios? Avol nichnas lifnim possible. But if in a normal situation, in 99.9% of the cases where the dam falls forward towards the mizbeach, it should be possible. And therefore, since the Mishnah didn't have that liflog v'lisnei b'didei, and it didn't make that chiluk, therefore we derive the conclusion that when dam spills from a kli, it's always kosher. And it doesn't matter whether the dam fell backwards, away from the mizbeach, or forwards towards the mizbeach. And therefore, we should certainly derive from this brisa the conclusion that a halacha shelo beregel is zippo. It's nothing. It doesn't register at all. And therefore, efshel l'taken, now the Kohen Kosher could step in. He's doing the avoda. He'll do the halacha, even though there was a halacha shelo beregel when the dam fell out of the kli and moved forward towards the mizbeach tuvta. And therefore, the Gemara says we rejected a proof for Ula, who was of the impression and ruled in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that there's no way of rectifying the situation of a halacha shelo beregel. Here we see no. It's very possible to say that there is rectification of halacha shelo beregel, like in the case where the dam fell from the kli and moved forward towards the mizbeach. Okay, now the Gemara is going to analyze our Mishnah back on Daf Yud Gimel that records a machlokas between Rabbi Shimon and the Chachamim. You may recall that Rabbi Shimon held that halacha is not really fully an avoda because it could be circumvented. Efshel levatla, if he would shech the carbon, the animal, right next to the mizbeach, he doesn't have to do any halacha, he just goes straight to the zrika. Itmar. Halacha shelo beregel machlokes Rabbi Shimon Rabbanan. Now we have a whole new take on the controversy between Chachamim and the Rabbanan. This is not the way we understood it until now. The Gemara is now saying that the issue is where the dam had holacha shelo beregel, and the Gemara now explains. If the holacha shelo beregel was rabasi, rabasi means that the shechita was done at a distance from the mizbeach, and therefore there is a need for a holacha. It's not close enough to the mizbeach to circumvent holacha. And in that case, the Gemara is saying that even Rabbi Shimon agrees that the carbon is going to be possible because the holacha rabasi was done shelo beregel. Ki pligi b'holacha zutroi. Let's say the case is where the Kohen shechted the animal right next door to the mizbeach, and here's where Reb Shimon says that holacha is totally irrelevant here. And he didn't even have to move forward towards the mizbeach. He could have just thrown the dam on the mizbeach without any holacha whatsoever. Therefore, if he decided to be molech, then that's not considered a chal Hashem holacha, which qualifies as an avoda, which therefore, if he had a machshava shelo lishma, it would passel the carbon. The Rabbanan, on the other hand, hold that such a machshava would passel the carbon, even though he didn't have to do a holacha, but he went ahead and he did a holacha, and if he had the wrong machshava, a disqualifying machshava during that holacha, then it disqualifies the carbon. And the Gemara says that when they heard back in Eretz Yisrael about this pshat, they laughed. Machaku Allah b'marov. They laughed at this. Now, just by way of introduction, it's kind of cute, but the Gemara is going to analyze why did they laugh at this in Marov. That's going to be a whole shakavitari. There's going to be one pshat and then another pshat. The first pshat is Ella chatas ha'of the psula b'machshava the Rabbi Shimon heichem ishkachesla. Now let's keep in mind that chatas ha'of has something very similar to chatas ha'pnimis, in the fact that it doesn't require a zrika in the classic sense. What the Kohen did was, after the shechita of the, well, actually, after the malika, whatever, of the olas ha'of, then he would take the bird, which now has blood spurting out, and he would just take the bird and apply it to the mizbeach, such that the dam would roll down the side of the mizbeach. And now we know, and nobody questions the following premise, that if he had a machshava poseles at the time of, and we'll try to figure out what that time is, the Gemara is going to vacillate about that, of the chatos ha'of, then it passes the carbon. A machshava, like any chatos, a machshava shelo lishma passes the carbon. So Gemara says like that. When exactly does that machshava passel the carbon? If he had the wrong machshava before the dam came out of the animal, before it started spurting, lo klumi. I mean, that machshava would not register, and we would not have a psul machshava because the Kohen is not in any way actively involved in the zrikas adam. Okay, there's something here that I don't understand right now. But anyway, lav klumhu. I see here that he's not interpreting exactly the way I did. I thought Makami delepul dam means before the dam came out of the bird. He's saying, which again, this requires a little more study, that he was actually holding the bird and he was swinging it up and down in order to start the Hazoyas Adam. But that's called a holacha zutri, a short holacha. Okay. Anyway, we're still trying to identify that, and pinpoint that time, that exact time in which the machshava passes the chatas ha'ov. Dam, if the dam has already come out of the neck of the bird, then it's avdu le mitzvasa. At that moment, the mitzvah was already completed, and therefore there's no room for any machshava poseles to passel the chatos. It's already too late. Because as soon as the blood is discharged from the bird, the avoda of hazoya is completed, even if it hasn't yet reached the mizbeach, and therefore a machshava poseles would not passel because his avoda is complete. So the Gemara says, "My kusha dilma midaparish vi'ad demotel mizbeach." There's a split second in time when the machshava poselis would invalidate the carbon. That's between the time that the blood separated from the bird until it actually reached the mizbeach. So there's a very short window of opportunity. When the dam leaves the body of the bird, the avodah of halacha ends, and the avodah of zrika, of hazaya, begins, which will continue until the dam reaches the mizbeach. In the interval, when the dam is between the oaf and the mizbeach, that's when a machshava posels would pass the karma. And the Gemara brings a raya for this. The boy named Rabbi Yirmiyah, ni Rab Zera. Right, Rabbi Yirmiyah had a question that he presented to Rabbi Zera Hoya Mazeh. Right, he was doing the hazaya of the dam, and in this case, it could be either a chatos pnimis, where you do hazaya on the mizbeach hapnimi, or chatos ha'of, where the hazaya is done on the mizbeach hachitzon. And then a terrible thing happened. He became a balmum. So again, like the dam is in the air, on its way to the mizbeach, and right at that split second, nikta yodo shel mazeh. Ad shelo higia dam liavira mizbeach. So the dam is now flying in the air towards the mizbeach. It's not on the mizbeach yet. It reaches the mizbeach once it hits the airspace above the mizbeach. That hasn't happened yet. Ma'u, the Amalei Reb Zera responded, psula, my timer. In other words, the Gemara now is vacillating, Rabbi Yirmiyah is vacillating about the following question. What is the avod of hazoyah? Is it the active hu'ua of the Kohen? Or is it in the chef to the dam when the dam reaches the mizbeach? Comes along Reb Zera and he answers Reb Yirmiyah, v'hizav v'nasan be'inon. It's not enough that the Kohen did a hazaya, meaning he already sent the dam into the airspace. No. The Torah requires v'nasan. It's got to reach the mizbeach. And that's going to teach us that the avoda of hazaya begins with the pu'ula, the action of the Kohen, but it doesn't end until the dam itself, the chefetz of the dam, reaches the mizbeach. Therefore, if the Kohen became a balmum, or let's say he had a machshava poselis while the dam is mamish in flight, it passes the karman, because then the avoda of v'nasan, i.e., when the dam reaches the mizbeach, was done bipsul. So therefore, the Gemara is explaining now why in Eretz Yisrael in the West they were joking when they heard that there is machlok between Reb Shimon and Rabbanan about holacha zutri, right? How is it called? Holacha zutrai. Second. The pasuk with regard to chatas pnimis is v'hizam en adam sheva pam l'fnei Hashem el espnei parochas hakodesh v'nosan hakohen min adam al kratos mizbeach tos hasamim. Right, so it has both v'hiza and it has v'nosan. And this is going to be alfusa, from which he derived that just like v'hiza, he starts the process, but it's not completed until v'nosan, the actual point when it reaches the mizbeach. And this is a pasuk with regard to chatas pnimis, but applies also to chatas ha'of. Now, Reb Shimon, it turns out, could hold that shalol lishma does not passel a carbon while the kohen is swinging the bird, because that's neither holacha nor zrika. Why? Because the blood is in the air, and we said v'nosan means it's got to reach the mizbeach. So now the Gemara offers an alternative explanation as to why they laughed about this in Marava. Ki osur of Papa Rav Huna ben Amri Hainu Chucha. What was the joke? Why did they laugh? Beholacha Rabase lo pliki? Are you telling me that there was no machlokus between Reb Shimon and the Rabbanan? Even Reb Shimon would concede that in Holacha Rabasi, the machshava ha-poseles would passel the korban, but ki pligi b'holacha Rabasi pligi. The original machlokus was about Holacha Rabasi. And that's where Reb Shimon had his svara that theoretically it didn't have to be a holacha at all. He could have done the shechita right next to the mizbeach. Even the Rabbana would agree that if he shechts the karman right next to the mizbeach and he didn't need any holacha, then if he decides to do some sort of holacha zutroy, that's meaningless. That's not an avoda, and it doesn't register as far as machshava poseles. Ki pligi b'holacha rabasi. Adarabah, the machlokas is about a halacha rabasi, where the Rabbanan say, look, he absolutely needs this halacha because he's far away from the mizbeach. And Reb Shimon looks at it theoretically and says, well, it could have been, had he been close to the mizbeach, that he wouldn't have needed the halacha. Holicho zar, as I said before, the Gemara has a whole series of questions. In this case, a non-Kohen brought the dam towards the mizbeach. With zero Kohen v'chazav holicho. The Kohen took it from the hands of the zar, took it back, and again did a holacha. Pligi ba b'nei Rab Chiya Rav Yana. Chad omer kosher, chad omer apostle. Mar savar efshel tkuna. According to the Mandi Omer, who says that it's kosher, the fact that the non-Kohen, the zar, did holacha is irrelevant. It's nothing. And the Yisrael could now retrace his steps, take the dam from the zar, and do a holacha. Mar savar lo efshel takna. He holds that now that the zar brought the dam close to the mizbeach, that registers a halacha psula, and it passels in a positive way the karma. No room for rectification. What about the fakert? Holicho Kohen Vichziro. What it would be in a case where the Kohen started his halacha towards the Mizbech with the dam, then he himself retraced his steps, and chazav holicho zar. This is just the opposite case of what we discussed before. And it all depends upon whether the first halacha registers or doesn't register. Omer Rav Shimi bar Ashli, l'divrei ha-machshir pasul, l'divrei ha-posel machshir. The one who in the first case said that it was possible, and why was it possible? Because he goes by the first halacha. Just 1 second, did I get that right? One second. L'divrei ha-machshir. The machshir means that even though the first halacha was done by the zar, the second halacha rectifies it. So the ikar halacha is the last halacha. And if that be the case, here it would be possible. Why would it be possible? Because the second halacha here was performed by the zar. Because the Yisrael brought it back, and now the zar pushed it forward and brought it to the point where the zar had originally brought it. L'divrei ha-posel machshir. But if in the previous case, where the Kohen took it back and then the zar brought it forward, and that's possible because the ikar is the last holacha. So here in this case, it would be kosher. Why? Because then you're basing everything on the original halacha. The first halacha, he says, is the defining act. And that's called l'divrei ha-posel because the original halacha was done by a guy in the previous case. But here the original halacha was done by Yisrael, therefore it's kosher. Rava disagrees. And he says, af l'divrei ha-posel posel. I'm going to claim that even if you posel it in the first case, where we said that the original halacha was done by the guy, and that's why, I'm sorry, I said guy, I meant to say by the zar, and that's why it's possible. So therefore here you would argue, as the Gemara argued before, that the original halacha was done by the Kohen kosher. Nevertheless, it's possible. My timer, the hot sarich. What happened in the second case? The Yisrael moved forward with the blood, then he went backwards. Now he has to go a second time, and he must do a halacha to get back to where he was before and bring the dam towards the mizbeach. And therefore, if he had a machshava poselis at that point, when he absolutely needs the halacha, because he retraced the steps and the first halacha is gone, then that machshava poselis would passel the korban.